its origin, Christianity was not a literate religion. Jesus himself may not have been able to read. When Jesus and his group kind of moved through the countryside of Galilee and then into Jerusalem, and then afterwards when Jesus dies, we shouldn't imagine that these different groups, these circles of believers in Jesus, had any kind of connection to written texts. So too, when Paul went out into the Greek world and founded different communities, Paul sent letters back and forth to them, but their faith was not based in text. So we have, in the very beginning of what would become Christianity, a set of traditions that circulated. And eventually, those traditions ended up into certain kinds of written documents. I can talk about 3 or maybe 4 different kinds of genres of documents: Gospels, letters, and acts or historical works. All were in Greek. The way we want to imagine this is that these different kinds of documents, and there were many of them, not just the ones that are contained in what we know today as the New Testament, went from community to community. They were read aloud to a mostly illiterate community, and people liked them or they didn't. So in the end, there are many more Gospels, for example, that float around, some of which some communities like and some of which they do not. Same to the letters, right? When a community may have had a problem, for example, it would write a letter, say to Paul or to some other authority, and receive a letter back in return, and that letter would be allowed and that letter would give guidance. So you have a whole set of these documents floating around these different Christian communities. Ultimately, though, right, selections are made. The large selection process really begins in probably the 3rd, maybe late 2nd century CE, and goes and is established in the 4th century, toward the end of the 4th century. Once you consolidate into an orthodoxy, you also have to think about theological issues, and then the texts that align with those kinds of theological positions. So the Christian Bible, right, becomes the New Testament as it's put together and sorted out from the different Gospels that are circulating, and the different letters, and also the Old Testament, right? That is the Greek Hebrew Bible. That's a very interesting and significant theological decision. There's nothing natural to that. That comes out of a debate in the 2nd century with Marcion and the Gnostic groups. Marcion and the Gnostics argued that in order to be a good Christian, you have to believe in Christ. But that Christ has nothing to do with the promise made to Abraham and the Jews. So for Marcion and the Gnostics, they were arguing that you could in fact have just a set of texts that reflect Jesus, and you don't in fact need the Old Testament at all. That was a battle in early Christianity. Do you include the Old Testament in the Christian Bible or don't you? As you know, right, from what later happens, in fact, the people who wanted the Old Testament included, the Orthodox bishops, in fact, won. They won. And the New Testament and the Old Testament are packaged together. It's worth noting here that there is no Old Testament without a New Testament. Jews do not call their book, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament because it's not old and it's not antiquated or superseded by the New Testament. So the New Testament, in a sense, is in itself a theologically driven term, as is the Old Testament. But by about the year 400, we more or less have the Christian canon as we know it, both the New Testament and the Old Testament together. So what does it contain? First, 4 Gospels. 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they're so called because they share much material, and Matthew and Luke probably draw on Mark, as well as some other common material. You can line them up in a kind of synoptic set of columns, and you can see the shared material. Acts of the Apostles, Right? This is a kind of history of what happens to the church after the death of Jesus, where the hero of that is Paul. We have the letters of Paul, including a number of letters that are attributed to Paul, but most scholars think are actually not from Paul. They're written in Paul's voice, but they seem to be written by other authors after Paul lived. And then we have a set of other letters, as well as the book includes with this book of Revelation, which is a bit of a strange book that talks about the apocalyptic end of the world. Now, in a Christian Bible or Catholic Bible, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, one sees the apocryphal books, or the books of the Apocrypha. These have kind of deuterocanonical status within the church. They consist of a number of books that seem to have been written by Jews in the Second Temple period, originally in Hebrew, were translated into Greek, and then were preserved by Christians. Jews never preserved the Apocrypha, and they don't use it or assign any authority to it, even though they're originally Jewish books, and they are clearly written and come into circulation prior to the coming of Jesus. So these books include books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the book of Tobit, a book of Susanna. These things all constitute the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha was cut from the Protestant Bible. So the Catholic Bible and the Protestant Bible, this is one of the different ways in which even Christian Bibles vary. Whereas the Catholics have the Apocrypha, the Protestants don't. Whereas the Catholic Bible is based on the Vulgate, the Latin translation, right? The Orthodox Bible is based on the Septuagint and the Greek version of the New Testament. And the Protestants are based on often new translations of the Hebrew, often through the King James Version. So the Christian Bible is not a single thing. It actually can vary quite a bit between different Christian groups.